Welcome to day 2 of the Melanie Top and Dress, and Take, it could be either of those, sew along. I am Laura. I will be here guiding you through all of this fun stuff. All right, so for day 2, we're starting to work on our bodice. All right, and we're gonna start with the back bodice, and we're gonna place these two pieces right sides together. So let's do that first. Okay, so I'm going to put it this way here. I'm going to grab a hem gauge. Make sure we're lined up here. We are. Okay. Where is it? Here it is. And a writing utensil. And from the neckline, which is here, I'm going to measure down about I'm going to measure down about 3/4 of an inch and mark it. Okay, so when we go to our sewing machine to stitch this using a stretch stitch, I'm going to stop. I'm going to stitch from, there we go. I'm going to stitch from the neckline, our 3/8 inch seam allowance, from the neckline down 3/4 of an inch. And then I'm going to back stitch, and I'm going to stop. Okay, now I need a better measuring tool. I need to measure from that mark down 10¼ inches. You can do smaller, you can do more. It's really up to you and your creativity. It depends on what you're wearing under it. I don't have any pretty like bralettes that I wear that have the pretty, crisscrossy backs or things like that. I don't have any of that, so I want to make sure my bra doesn't show. So I'm going to give myself another inch. And so instead of doing 10¼ inches, I'm going to do 9¼ inches from that point. And I'm going to grab a different color pen, and I'm going to mark that as well. Okay. Now grab my clips. I'm going to clip just here, and then however many clips you need. I just want to make sure that that stays open for what I'm doing. If you're not doing an opening, because you don't have to, you're just going to stitch using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and you can use a stretch stitch, or technically you could use a serger, only if you're doing, you're not leaving an opening. So if you're not leaving an opening, 3/8 inch seam allowance all the way down the back using a stretch stitch or a serger. You can even use a zigzag if you like. That's what you're going to do. If you're doing an opening like I'm doing, I highly suggest using a sewing machine and using the stretch stitch. Don't use your serger on this part, because this is going to have to be opened and ironed and top stitched, and you can't open it if you're using a serger. I hope that makes sense. So let's head over to our sewing machine. We're going to stitch this 3/4 of an inch, and then we're going to start at our next marking and stitch all the way down the rest of the back using a stretch stitch with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. All right, so now that we've done this, we're going to press this back seam open, and then we're going to edge stitch down either side. If you've serged all the way down and you're not having that opening, then you don't need to do this part unless you want to. If you serged, or if you sewed the whole thing shut with your sewing machine, you can still do the top stitching. But if you've serged it, you don't want to do that. Does that make sense? And that's only for if there's no opening. So for those of us that did an opening, we used our sewing machine and used the stretch stitch, and then now we will open this up and press it open, and then we will edge stitch. I'll use my cover stitch machine. You can use a stretch stitch, or So an optional thing for the open back is to run a stretch stitch or a bar tack stitch across the bottom of the opening, right where the seams meet. This will prevent that spot from opening up as stress is placed on it. I haven't had that problem, but that's definitely something that you can do. Okay, so now let's open up this seam. Now this, I learned that this particular fabric did not like, or my sewing machine rather, did not like it. It kept wanting to eat it, which is really unusual. I don't often have that issue with my sewing machine. So you'll see at the very top, I put a little piece of interfacing there because I could not get it to not eat this fabric. It is a light double brush poly. It's not a heavy one, and maybe that's just too light. My sewing machine didn't like it. And that just is a rarity for my machine. But anyway, I did use a little piece of just random scrap interfacing just to be able to stitch it there. Okay. So where this folds out 3/8 of an inch, you also need to fold out that opening as well. Okay, so don't skip the opening because you've got to edge stitch that as well. Okay, so I'm just doing one side at a time. It just makes it a little bit easier for me. All right, so we're gonna edge stitch up either side of these, on both sides of the seam, if I can talk, all the way down. All right, so I'm gonna go to my cover stitch machine and we are going to work on this. Okay, here we go. I'm gonna give this, it is not perfect, but I'm gonna give this a quick press. All right, here we are, all edge stitch, looking nice. We've got our opening. All right, let's move this to the side and let's grab our tutorial. Let's not move this to the side. And now let's grab our tutorial. And for step 3, we're gonna fold the hem of each bodice piece up 1 inch toward the wrong side and pin and press in place. So let's grab our hem gauge. And this is the back bodice. I'm going to repeat this with the front bodice. So set this to the side. All right, now we're going to head to our sewing machine or our cover stitch machine, and we are going to hem both of these. And we will be right back. Okay, so we've got our pieces here. Now, again, we're referring to our tutorial and we are going to find that it's time to attach our shoulders together and our side seams together. So let's put both the front bodice and the back bodice right sides together. I'm going to fold this up here because I want to line up the shoulder seams first. And what we're going to do, we're going to line up our shoulder seams. We're going to head over to our serger, and we are going to serge these shoulder seams together using a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You can also use a stretch stitch for this. Okay, so now that we've done that, we got to work on our side seams. So we're going to line up each of our side seams and we're going to give them, we're going to clip them. Okay, so let's refer to our instructions right now because this part is a little bit different because we're making room for the side ties. So here's what it says. We are on page 20. number 5. It says match the side seams right side together and sew using a stretch stitch and a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now we normally use a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but because we have to add these ties, we need a 5/8 inch seam allowance. We also need to use our sewing machine with a 5/8 inch seam allowance using a stretch stitch because we don't want to cut off any of this fabric. Now it says if you are only ruching one side, you can trim the excess seam allowance off on the other side, but make sure that you still use a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to decide which side I want the ruching on. It really doesn't matter. And then the other side, I'm not going to put the ruching. So if you're not putting, this is what I'm going to do because I'm just going to do a little shortcut here. On one side, I'm going to use my serger. So on this side, I'm going to use my serger at a 5/8 inch seam allowance. On this side, I'm going to use my machine at a 5/8 inch seam allowance using a stretch stitch. All right, being sure that I use a 5/8 inch on both of them. So I'm going to start at my serger and I'm going to end at my regular machine. I hope that makes sense to everyone. Here we go. Okay, here we are. That took a whole lot more effort than I thought it would. Now you could see that I ended up using paper between my presser foot and my feed dogs and my fabric because I was having such a hard time sewing. I have never had this issue before to this degree with fabric. So what I did is, it was very common sometimes when making bags. Now, normally I would use like tissue paper, pattern paper, whatever, but I didn't have any. This is just regular paper. So I sewed across that, but now I just need to go through and you're just removing it. So I've got most of it off that side. And if you see any other lingering pieces, you can grab something that has an eraser and you can just use the eraser and it pulls it right out of those stitches. It's a lot easier, like I said, with tissue paper. All right, so you can see here, on one side I have serged, on the other side I have stitched my 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now that we have done that, I'm just going to turn this bodice right side out so you can see how it's looking so far. So we are already hemmed. We can give that a press again, and we have our shoulders and our side seams together, and we've got our beautiful back opening. And we are now ready for day 3.